primeval history of Genesis, an ancient war began between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve. Fallen angels called Watchers begot a race of giants called Nephilim, their goal to stop the bloodline of the promised seed. But God had other plans. Chronicles of the Nephilim is a biblical fantasy series of novels that charts the rise and fall of the Watchers and the Giants in the stories of the Bible and in between. Read all 8 novels, from Noah Primeval all the way to Jesus Triumphant. Available on Kindle and paperback at Amazon.com. Go to chroniclesofthenephilim.com and enter a world of ancient history and biblical imagination. That's chroniclesofthenephilim.com.
Hello and welcome to The Sharpening. I am your host, Josh Peck. Tonight we have a very special guest, a returning guest, Brian Godawa. For those of you who have been following the show, you probably remember him from episode 24, which was actually The Sharpening's very first video interview. And since we've tried that, we have not looked back. That was such a big success, and a lot of you out there have expressed how much you like the video interviews. So now we have video and audio available for most shows. So that was the start of the Sharpening video interviews, and I am happy to announce that we have Brian Godawa back on the show. For those of you who didn't see the first one, that again was episode 24, called The Noah Controversy. And for those of you who are not familiar with Brian Godawa, he's been a professional filmmaker, writer, and visual artist for many years. He is the screenwriter for the award-winning feature film To End All Wars, starring Kiefer Sutherland, and Alleged, starring Brian Dennehy as Clarence Darrow, along with Fred Thompson as William Jennings Bryan. Brian's scripts have won multiple awards, and his articles on movies and philosophy have been published around the world. His popular book, Hollywood Worldviews, Watching Films with Wisdom and Discernment, has been released in a revised edition from InterVarsity Press and is used as a textbook in schools around the country. He is also author of Chronicles of the Nephilim, and he has a new book in that series called David Ascendant, which will be the topic of tonight's show. So, without further ado, I'd love to welcome back to the show Brian Godawa. Brian, how are you doing?
Good, Josh. How are you? Great to be here.
I'm doing great. It's great to have you back on. I was just saying before we started recording, I can't believe it's been about 6 months since we last had you. You don't have anything to say about that?
Oh, I thought the audio went out. Sorry.
No, I just stopped talking because I finished my thought.
Okay. Yeah, 6 months. Woohoo! Hey, I write a book every 6 months, so yeah, basically that's I should be on your show every 6 months.
Absolutely, that's awesome. I'm trying to get in that groove myself. I finished Quantum Creation in July, and I'm now working on a new book called Cherubim Chariots, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get it out before the new year. But I'm almost there where I can get out 2 books a year. So.
Well, you do a lot of heavy research too, so that makes it, I think a little bit more complicated and difficult than just, say, writing some kind of like a novel or something. But even then, I mean, my novels are based on a lot of research too. So, yeah, it can be a lot of work.
Oh yeah, fiction. I've tried writing fiction before, and it's a nightmare. I'll probably revisit it sometime in the future, but that's a whole other animal. There's a lot that goes into fiction writing that not a lot of people would really think about. But I know when I was doing my fiction writing, this was before I was doing all this, so it wasn't anything any good, but it was just trying to figure out all the character plots and storylines and all that, even before, storyboarding, all that before even starting the writing process. I think nonfiction's easier.
Okay, fair enough. No, it's true. Yeah, you really do have to work out a lot of things when you're using your imagination that you don't have to when you're doing nonfiction. You do nonfiction, you do the research, and then you find the connections, you make the connections. But a lot of times in fiction, you have to make up the connections, and they've got to be entertaining. And so, in a way, you might be right. On the other hand, for my biblical fiction, it's very similar to yours. Is I don't want to make up too much stuff anyway, because I want it to be all based on real possibilities, So, so it's kind of similar to what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a big part of it too. And I love what you're doing. I love the whole idea of kind of novelizing these stories and uh, putting in, filling in the blanks, but without, still keeping it biblically accurate, which I think is really cool. And that's got to be challenging.
Yeah, it is. It really is. I mean, what I've been amazed at is when you really do the research and you kind of get it all going up there in your head, you poured all this research into your head, and it starts to make those connections. You start to find things that were there that you didn't see before. But also when you are looking for that, like when you do have to make something up, for instance, it's amazing how many things just fit right into place that you didn't even anticipate. I mean, I found when I was doing a lot of my research for pretty much all the books of the Chronicles of the Nephilim, but in particular, I would say one of my favorite ones was the Gilgamesh Immortal. Gilgamesh, was not a guy in the Bible, but actually some thinks he may have been named something else in the Bible, so he may be in there. And so I tell the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is an ancient story, ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian story, and I integrated into my biblical storyline. But I was amazed at how many I didn't change the Epic of Gilgamesh very much at all, because what was already there fit into not only my own storyline, but even some of the things I made up. So it was really amazing how when you do enough research, a lot of things happen serendipitously, or as I would say, providentially.
There you go. Yeah, absolutely. That seems to have happened with my nonfiction books as well. This new book, it builds off from my last book, Quantum Creation. It's not in any way like Quantum Creation Part 2 or anything like that, but I find like each time I write a book, it seems to build off the last, or even earlier than that, because my first book, Disclosure, a lot of Quantum Creation built off of that, and now this new one's building off of Quantum Creation. And then I have 7 or 8 other books kind of in between. They're just smaller, shorter ones. But yeah, it's interesting how that happens, and I'm loving the ride.
Likewise.
So the last time that we had you on, we talked about Noah, and now because I mentioned it in the first show. Now we're right about the time that the new Exodus movie is coming out, and I know there's not a whole lot of information out, but I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, because besides the 2 or 3 trailers that's out right now about it, I know nothing about it. So
yeah,
so
and I think
what do you got?
I think the studios learned a lesson from the Noah experience, that if they don't really follow the Bible, they're going to be in trouble. But interestingly, when I say follow the Bible, I don't mean in the old-time fundamentalist sense where it's like, oh, if you don't follow every little strict detail, we're going to jump on you. Because I think a lot of Christians these days are not picky like that. They're more concerned about the theme and the meaning.
Right.
Of the, rather than changing the details. People didn't have as much problem with the rock monsters in Noah as they did with the fact that the God in Noah really didn't exist. If you really look at it closely, he was it was really just hallucinations and delusions and people interpreting, but there was no real existentially objective God that could have existed in that. And the serpent, the subversion of the serpent imagery is positive, whereas in the Bible it's negative. All these kinds of things that were going on in Noah. But what happened was that when they started showing it to the Christian and Jewish audiences, they got all these negative feedback, and then they stopped showing it. And now I haven't heard anything about Exodus. They're holding it really close to their vests, and I hope that's not a bad sign. I have had a positive hope for Exodus and over Noah, but we'll see what happens. And when the movie comes out, I'll be reviewing it on my blog post, my movie blog, which is at Godawa.com. But what's interesting about this one is Ridley Scott is actually a fantastic filmmaker. You know,
Oh
the
yeah.
maker of Gladiator and a dozen other great movies, and so he actually can tell a good story, unlike Aronofsky with Noah. Aronofsky, has the reputation for making these brooding, hyper negative anti-hero movies that nobody sees. And so it was kind of shocking to me that they would choose him to make a blockbuster big budget movie, because they always go for more the straight hero stories in blockbusters because they want to make money, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think the fact that Noah made like 1/3 of what it could have made, so it actually did terribly. Despite the fact, don't listen to them when they say, but it made $330 million worldwide. Yeah, but it cost them probably $500 million to make the movie and to market and all that. Or maybe at least 400 million or more. But the point is they really didn't make money on it, and they could have made 3 times that, like Captain America did at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Because it was such a beloved story. But because they had a bad filmmaker, I think, bad storyteller, basically, it wasn't as appealing. Ridley Scott, however, is a great storyteller. He follows a good traditional paradigm that I think a lot of people will love in that sense. But with the Christian Bale's latest remarks coming out, that to him, his research is that Noah was a schizophrenic, more than likely a schizophrenic, and that he was one of the most barbaric men he's ever read.
Oh
And
gee.
this kind of ignorant bigotry, to me, is a bad sign. Now, it's entirely possible that that's Christian Bale's attitude, perception, and it may not be in the movie, and that's what we'll have to wait to see. But those are code words. Schizophrenia and barbarism apply to a Bible character are code words. They're dog whistles for the new atheists, which basically, schizophrenia is, it's a mental illness that includes hallucinations and hearing voices, right? And of course, if you think Moses was like that, well, then the voices he heard was not God. They were just, obviously there's no real God, that kind of thing.
Right.
That's what that's hinting at. He hasn't really got out and explained himself any further, so we'll see. But those are code words for that kind of thinking. And the other concept of calling Moses barbaric more than any other man he's read about, I'm like, really? Like Hitler, Mao, Stalin, these men who murdered 150 million people in the name of atheism, more people in the 20th century than in all of religious history in the name of atheism, killed more than that, and Moses is more barbaric than that. Well, again, I think this reference is a code word, is a dog whistle for the new atheist notion that the law of God, the law of Moses, is barbaric, and then they trot out all these things. Well, the Bible supports slavery, and the Bible's, treats women as second-class citizens, and all this baloney. Because they take the Bible out of context, and these new atheists, they'll quote these Bible passages. They don't understand the notion of indentured servitude, and they don't understand that the slavery, the English word for slavery in the Bible is not what we think of it in the modern day world. It's really not the same thing. There's all kinds of cultural contexts that they're not taking into consideration, which ultimately makes them cultural imperialists.
Yeah.
Ignorant of ancient cultures and not willing to understand them within their context, and it breeds this bigotry against basically Jews, Christians, and the Bible in a way that atheists have been exploiting most recently. And Christians, sadly, Christians are not very well informed, because they tend to stick so much with the New Testament and the love of God and Jesus, and these are all good things and true things. But I think that a lot of Christians themselves have created a false picture of the God of the Bible, and they kind of ignore the Old Testament because it is scary, violent, frightening to them. They don't know how to deal with it, so they just stick with Jesus and love. But they create a false picture, so when these people bring out these accusations against the Old Testament, a lot of Christians can't even deal with it, and so they're in a, so these are the things. This is the kind of talk that is already starting. I've been quoted in Hollywood Reporter because on my blog, I kind of joked about it, and I said, well, wow, first a Noah who's a environmentalist, wacko, vegan nutcase, delusionary nutcase. Now Moses is schizophrenic barbarian. What's next? A Jesus who's Christophobic and hates and wants to sin and hates God. And then I said, oh wait. Martin Scorsese already did that with The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah.
But then I did, but then I have reservations because we also hear some other rumblings, where Ridley Scott has sort of mentioned that, like with the Red Sea parting, he tries to make it more naturalistic. He's trying to make the miracles more naturalistic, which again is not necessarily inherently bad because, of course, he mentioned that his parting of the Red Sea is not going to be the two sides, but it's going to be a tsunami created by an earthquake, and that's why the waters pull back and then the waters come in, right? And
okay.
But that's not inherently unbiblical, folks. I mean, we don't know how the Red Sea parted, and the way they described it in ancient biblical terms might not be the way we would describe it, and that's a pretty well-timed tsunami, if you ask me. So I mean, it could still be miraculous, but my only concern here is that those are the rumblings that make me go, oh, is he going to try to naturalistically explain all the miracles away and make it look like maybe there could be a God or not? Is he going to subvert the sacred narrative like Aronofsky did? I don't know. I'm getting a little worried because of his statements, and we'll just have to wait and see for sure if that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I saw talking about naturalizing the miracles in Exodus. I saw this documentary a few years ago on the History Channel, and it was funny because they weren't trying to say that the plagues didn't happen. They were trying to naturalize them and say, well, one builds off of another, and this happened. We get frogs because there were the flies, and so on and so forth. And the whole time I'm thinking, like, that doesn't disprove what, because they were trying to use that to say that the Bible is not an accurate record, but in reality, nothing that they were saying was really contradicting the Bible anyway. So they were kind of showing two different messages, and I was like,
that's a good and you know what? Something else about biblical miracles that I think Christians have a false understanding sometimes themselves of what miracles are.
Yeah.
And I've always contended that miracles are not absurdities. In other words, God can do things that are not natural or go against the natural laws, so to speak, which that's also another concept. But God can operate in such a way that it's different from the way that normal nature works, okay? But that doesn't mean he does absurd things, like like for instance, C.S. Lewis made this argument, for example, when Jesus turned the water to wine, what he did wasn't some absurdity that has no connection to the natural world, because in fact, water does turn to wine in the natural world. If you think about it, water gets sucked up into the plant creates grapes, and the grapes become wine. He just sped up the process, right? And
that's awesome.
And his point there was that God doesn't like do absurd things like suspend all the natural laws in the universe to do this one thing. I don't think that's how he operates. I think that he does transcend, the way he normally operates in nature. And so what I'm saying is, like you, I agree, and I think more Christians are realizing this too, that miracles can have natural sort of aspects to them. They're not absurd out of the sky type of things, is what I'm saying. And so consequently, it's all about the timing, and and that's miraculous, and there's going to be a natural aspect to miracles. If you were to be there when Lazarus's body resurrected, if you were to look at his genes under a microscope, you might see them miraculously regenerating. So what's wrong with that? It's still, the point is God has still resurrected Lazarus, right? And so, that's not bad. But there's another element that I think is important to be aware of too, that Christians have to be careful, because This notion about Moses. Another thing Christian Bale said, which I am in agreement with in many ways. That Moses was very mercurial, and he was very troubled, and had a very troubled faith, and I would agree with that, and many Christians do. And in fact, Moses was a sinner. I would go so far as to say Moses was a sinner. I mean, he murdered a man.
Absolutely.
He got full of rage and disobeyed God and hit the rock with his staff instead of talking to it. You could probably point out many other things that Moses got out of line at times, right? And Christians need to be aware that the unique difference about the Bible actually is that our sacred heroes are not perfect men. In pretty much every other religious literature, their hagiography, their tales of their saints or whatever, they tend to be pretty much, holy and above everybody else. But in the Bible, they're not. They're very earthy, like even David, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so Moses wasn't a perfect holy man, and he blew it. But all the greater that's the point, is that God is the one who's delivering these people, not Moses. Moses is not sinless. Only Jesus was, right? And so it's okay. Christians are not condemning something because you're making the hero Moses be a fallible human being. That's not what we're arguing against. What we're dealing with is, but are you going beyond that point, like Aronofsky did? Where he made Moses this madman who wanted to murder his children. And madman with delusions. When Christian Bale says this, that he was the most barbaric man I've ever read about, you're like, okay, Moses had faults, but most barbaric you've ever read about. That's a code word saying it's more than just Moses was a sinner and had a character flaws and he had a hero's journey just like everybody else to learn and grow. That's hinting at something much more than that. That's hinting at, really, in a way, an anti-Mosaic, anti-Jewish sort of mentality, sentiment, that this law of the Jews is barbaric, Yeah. And again, these are code words that are hinting at something worse than what I suspect all of us would agree to. Moses was imperfect sinner.
Absolutely, and that rings true, like as you said, with all biblical heroes, and that's. I love that because it's personally identifying, because I'm certainly broken and fallen and have more than my fair share of character flaws, and that's what when I read the Bible, it really helps. It's more personal, and I really like that. So do you think this whole so we had the Noah movie, and then now we have this Exodus movie coming out, and
before we get into my book, is that what you're going to get into?
Not quite yet. I just had one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll let you lead because it's your show. I had another thing I want to talk about David, but because they're going to Ridley Scott has signed up to make a David movie, and let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah, that actually does lead into my question, and I'll say when I have a guest on too, it's not my show, it's both of our shows. So.
Fair enough.
But yeah, absolutely. But I was going to ask, do you think that this is a common trend that we're going to be seeing now, where there's going to be these big box office movies based on biblical things, but that aren't really, portraying it in a godly way? Do you think that's like a trend that we're going to be seeing more and more now? When I hadn't heard about the David movies, so
that's what I fear. Because again, let's not forget, as great of a filmmaker Ridley Scott is, he did give us Jesus was an alien, right? With Prometheus.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a good track record, and he, the writer of the movie was an atheist. So the writer of Exodus was an atheist. So it doesn't bode well. Of course, again, Christians are going to be attacked. Oh, atheists can make good movies about about Bible stories. It doesn't have to only be Christians. No, that's not the point. What we're saying is, of course, there are even good movies that have been made by people who were atheists, and like Chariots of Fire, for instance, right? That was a pretty fair movie, but it's far and few between. And secondly, it's not a good sign, because they're not going to understand the meaning that's going to connect with the broader audience that the studios want. And that's the danger. But I've done in the research for my so we hear Ridley Scott's going to maybe do the David movie, right? And I've been doing research on King David for my new novel that's just came out. And so I happen to read both liberal and conservative scholarship on this stuff, and I happen to know that the latest, hottest scholarship on David is, of course, led by liberals who don't really believe the Bible, and they've just dominated the field, and you know, with their fairy tale notions of what really happened in the Bible, they make up stuff arbitrarily. It's absurd, but they come with this stuff, and that becomes the fad. And the latest fad in King David is best found in David Halpern's book, which is called, I don't have the name. Give me a second. I have, oh, there it is. David, I was looking at my bookshelf. David's Secret Demons. And basically his argument was the books of Samuel and Chronicles about the story of David are an apologetic for his kingship. And actually, all scholarship agrees with that. In other words, it's making the argument that, you know, David did not try to kill the king. He tried to stay true to God's anointed, to obey him, even though the king tried to kill him, right? It tries to show that David, you know, tried to obey God, but it shows he did sin many times, being murderous and adultery. We all know about Bathsheba, right? It shows his sins, but the modern day scholarship, well, first of all, modern day scholarship believes that David didn't even exist. And then, of course, in the 90s, you get this archaeological dig that unveils the House of David. So clearly, you know, there was the David lineage. And now, so they come up with all different ways to try to deny that. But the fact is that David was historical. Then they try to say, well, David actually occurred earlier in time, and he was really just a rabble-rouser running around like a terrorist, right? And this is what David Halpern kind of goes down, the path he goes down. He says, because it's an apologetic defending David's kingship, therefore, everything they say is the opposite of what really happened.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, right? So in other words, yeah, the reason why it goes out of its way to show that David tried not to kill King Saul is because he did. The reason why it goes out of its way to, you know, whatever, talk about David's lineage is because he wasn't from the tribe of Judah, or, you know, those kinds of things. And really, he was a serial killer who just murdered his way up to the top to be king, and then created a false history to justify himself. And this is modern scholarship, see? And of course, you know, Hollywood is going to love that. They're going to, yeah, let's subvert the David story we all know and show that really he was a serial killer, you know, and terrorist, basically. He's a serial killer terrorist and all this kind of stuff. And so I know that that's the popular, fashionable, you know, liberal theological view. And again, there's no evidence of this. It's reading against the text, which is a, you know, very, you know, popular modern postmodernist deconstruction technique. To which I say, well, okay, well, if you're going to apply that technique to the Bible, then apply it to every other apologetic work, which most history is apologetic, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
From Thucydides to onward, right? So it's like, hello, then you have to deny whatever anyone says really happened. It really was the opposite. I mean, that's the kind of absurd and, quite frankly, immoral exegesis that goes on in the name of scholarship, because people hate the Bible, they hate God's law, and they don't want it to be real, so they craft these fairy tales, and then because a scholar said it, it must be true, right? And people don't look into this for themselves. So all that long, blustering sermon of mine was just to make the point that because I know that that's the view of David, I would fear whatever Hollywood's going to do about David unless someone at the helm is actually someone who loves and respects the David story and will retell it according to the audiences who would love that story, you see? And at this point, I doubt that Ridley Scott really is the man for the job. And I think there are other actually Christian writer-directors that I think could do a fantastic job, with me writing the script, of course.
Of course.
No, that'll never happen because I'm Satan to Hollywood now. But my point is that, you know, there are other competent directors like Scott Derrickson, you know, who's a Christian and he's a great horror director and he can make a good film. And, you know, I think I would suspect that he would be a good option. I don't know, but these are the thoughts that run through my head that make me go, You know, they're already subverted Noah. It doesn't look good for Moses. We'll see. And so I don't have a lot of hope. And then what happens is they hire these Christian marketing firms to market it to Christians. And it's like they have no scruples, no moral scruples about whether or not the story is actually subverting their own faith. They just try to sell it to Christians anyway, because that's what they did with Noah. And I know these guys. I know some of these guys. They have theological degrees who are marketing Noah to Christians and stuff. And I know they know better. I know they knew what was going on with that movie. They couldn't have been ignorant. They could see the subversion that was going on. But in the name of, we want to have conversation, we want to have dialogue, all of which I agree, and I don't have any problem. If you're going to do your godless movie about Noah or, whatever, fine, you have every right to. In terms of our economy, but it's just odd to me that the studios who want to make a lot of money by making blockbuster movies that appeal to a lot of people, why would they do the opposite of making money unless they had personal agendas of some kind? And so my concern there is, they're going to still try to sell this to Christians, and whether or not it really is a legitimate option. I remember when the Noah was coming out, when they were doing screenings of Noah, and all the religious crowds were basically not liking it. So they stopped everything, pull back, hold it to your vest, don't let anybody see it anymore. And then they recut the trailers for Noah to look like they're really biblical. And I'm like, I saw the trailer, I'm like, wow, that looks really cool, So they, studios know how to trick us to get us into that opening weekend, So be careful of these trailers. I even saw the Exodus trailer, which looked cool.
Oh, yeah.
Showed a shot of the Red Sea thing, showed some of the plagues. It looked very biblical, but again, you can't trust studio trailers because they cut. You can cut a trailer. You could cut the Exodus movie to look like a romantic comedy if you wanted, actually. And YouTube has actually done that with like Jaws and with horror movies, and they'll recut a trailer, make it look like it's a comedy. So you can make a movie look like anything you want in the trailer, and so it's really, I wouldn't trust the trailers, But, if you're interested in a movie but you don't want to waste your money if it's a Christian or anti-Jewish, then save your money and wait to, read blogs like mine after the first weekend and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the opposite problem too, because in the Christian community, and people might, well, I'm just going to give my opinion anyway. A lot of Christian movies aren't very good.
Oh, that's putting it lightly, my friend. Look, I don't want to name names here because, quite frankly, I do believe Christian films are getting better, technically better. I do think they're trying, and that is a genre. Christian movies is a genre that has formulas just like every other genre. So you can't necessarily condemn the Christian movies just because it has formulas like you have to have a pastor, you have to have a church scene, that kind of stuff. You have to have someone saying, if you believe in Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, whatever the rules are, you can't show cleavage, all these silly unbiblical rules, no matter, but nevertheless, they're family friendly, they have a certain audience, that's what that audience wants. So I'm not even against the genre in and of itself. The problem is that there's still, I watch some of these movies that have made gazillion dollars, that Christian movie that's made a lot of money, and they're so poorly done and they're so disingenuous, I don't even believe them, and I'm a Christian. And I'm like, I try so hard to tell my stories with an authenticity and to be honest and truthful, and a lot of these Christian movies aren't. Some of them are. I'm not saying they're all aren't, because there's this other Hollywood Christian contingent that just damns all the Christian movies. They have no. It's like they want to be friends with the world, and they want to be accepted, so they feel they have to damn every Christian movie, right? And I'm not going that far. Like I said, they're trying, they're getting better, but still, mostly, I cringe and I can't be a part of that. It's not true. It's still not truthful enough yet to me. And
a
so
lot of
hope
them
that they will be.
Oh yeah, I hope so too. Yeah, a lot of them have those, the cookie cutter Christian characters, and and the acting.
Yeah,
I'm not a filmmaker or anything. I don't really know a lot about that kind of stuff. But I know when I can get lost in a movie and when I can't. And I like getting lost in movies.
Yeah.
And I have not seen a movie like that, and I don't want to name movie titles either, but I'm sure I take your pick. But when there will be times where I can get kind of lost, but then one not main character, will like kind of come in, and it's just you can tell they were just giving her the job because they were friends or something, because the acting is so atrocious, and the dialogue even. I'm a Christian. I don't talk like that. I don't say those kinds of things. I don't like like when I find out
Amen.
like somebody's saved or something. Like if I meet somebody and they're like I'm a Christian. Well, I don't even say it like that, but just when it comes up that I find out somebody I know is saved, I don't jump up and down and clap my hands and say we're brothers. I don't freak out about it. Like it's crazy. I'm just like, oh, cool, and we'll have some interesting talks, I'm sure. Like it's never like this exuberant thing that just
Praise the Lord!
Yeah, it's the highlight of my life. It's a good thing, but I've never met anybody that acts like that. But you see that kind of stuff all the time in those types of movies, and so I absolutely agree. It's disingenuous.
And again, I want to also sort of add a caveat and remind people that don't forget Christian movies are extremely micro budget movies, like a couple $100,000 or something like that. And if the truth be told, there are just as many bad secular movies that are made at that money level, because you can't get as high a quality of actors many times in that budget level. You see what I'm saying? So as they get more money for their budget, I think they should become better. It's not always true, but I think one good example of that might be like this Mom's Night Out, where it still had a lot of problems. It wasn't very funny, but it was definitely a lot better acting, with actors like Patricia Heaton in there and stuff, and Samwise, what's his name? The guy who played Samwise in The Lord of the Rings.
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember the actor's name.
His name escapes me. Forgive me. Anyway, they've got some good actors in that movie, and it's getting better, and the writing's a little bit smoother. Still has some problems in my opinion, but I think that's an example where they had a little bit more money, so they did a better job. And I think that we have to be aware of that reality as well. If like for instance, look, if you could get $30 million, you could get a better writer and some better actors than they have in Christian movies.
Absolutely. And the good thing too is that still people are getting saved from them. There are people that can that aren't as hard-headed as I am and can look past that and still get some kind of edification, and even some people have been saved through those. So it's at least. It's good, and it is good to see that the genre is getting a little bit better than it was even a few years ago. So I'm hoping that trend will continue. But they certainly have a huge opponent with these blockbuster movies that are subverting everything.
Yeah, they're taking our sacred stories and retelling them according to the secular narratives, and that's the thing that really, is sad.
Yeah, same here. We need we need more people like you out there that are taking these stories and still telling them in a in a fiction type of set. They're not, the stories themselves aren't fiction because they're biblical, but putting kind of filling in the blanks and telling a good story from there, which is what you've done with Chronicles of the Nephilim. And but actually, before we get into David, your new book, for those who might not be familiar with the series as a whole, what is the series, and what kind of led you to write this whole Chronicles of the Nephilim?
Sure. About 5 years ago or so, I was actually working on a screenplay for Noah, and I was doing the research, and I stumbled upon Michael Heiser's writings, and Michael Heiser is a evangelical scholar who writes a lot about the Nephilim and the Watchers and such, and his work opened my eyes, much like Elisha's servant, to see the heavenly host around him, right? Because his scholarship was very solid. It wasn't kooky. It wasn't, you know, whatever, off the edge type stuff. I tend to prefer more scholarly research in what I'm doing and such, so when I read his work, it sort of opened my eyes to this storyline of the War of the Seed that I call it in my series. But and it all began with that passage. The most bizarre passage in the Bible for me has always been Genesis 6:1-4, and that's where it
Same
talks
here.
about the sons of God, the Watchers, coming from heaven, mating with the daughters of men, and they bore them Nephilim, or giants, who were men of old and renowned. And you know, I'd always just skipped over that passage because it's just weird. There are weird things in the Bible that you may never figure out, right? But then
Right.
Kaiser's research opened up this doorway, and I started doing more into other areas. And I saw this storyline, you know, because I started realizing, oh, there's more passages. Like, oh yeah, well that's right. The Numbers 32 talks about going into the Promised Land, and it's full of Anakim giants. And then David did kill Goliath, but there's other giants in there too. And I would always just sort of go, oh, that's an oddity. But now I realize, no, there's this storyline that's connected all these giants, and what is that? What is that storyline? And as I looked into it further, I realized that I was, you know, screenplay for Noah, and then when I discovered that the Noah movie was being made, and I realized, okay, I'm not, you know, Aronofsky was making the movie, and so I'm not going to beat him to the punch. I'm not going to get my movie made. So I went ahead and adapted it right into the novel, and in the act of doing that, I realized there's so many more stories that need to be told in continuation with this. And so I did. I just started working on it, and now I'm up to the 7th one, which is David. So the first one was Noah Primeval. Second one is Enoch Primordial. It's like a prequel. I go back before Noah, and so we meet Methuselah when he's young, and that. And Enoch was the first giant killer, I say. And which of course is based on extra biblical literature that is not scripture, but it is highly respected, such as the book of First Enoch.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, so I did other what I wanted. The premise of the series was this. I said, look, what if, you know, as I did more research, I found out, you know, the Bible says some strange things sometimes, like you know, the gods of the ancient world. You know, Moses is talking about the gods of Canaan, for instance, and it says, you know, these Canaanites sacrifice to demons, not to gods.
Yeah.
And so there's this demonic aspect to the Canaanite gods that I thought, well, you know, something else that's kind of interesting is in ancient history, all the nations had a pantheon of gods that they believed in. And each of them had, you know, different cities that they were patrons over and all this kind of stuff. And so I thought, well, what if the ancient gods, the gods of the ancient world, were real supernatural beings? Only they weren't the gods that the people thought they were. They might have been these demonic fallen watchers, right? And, you know, it's speculation, but I just thought it would make sense. That makes them demonic, and it would give them real beings with real powers, right? And that sort of led me into pushing envelope a little bit more and just saying, okay, well, let's depict that in this series. And, you know, like I said, the Bible talks about the Watchers as territorial spirits over nations in Daniel, and in extra biblical literature we read more about that. But in Deuteronomy, for instance, 32, we read about how God allots nations under the authority of fallen sons of God. And so all these interesting things that I had sort of ignored or didn't understand, and they all kind of fit together. So that's where I started telling the storyline. And then I went to book 3 with Gilgamesh, Immortal, and people go, well, Gilgamesh isn't in the Bible. Yeah, he isn't, but he is connected in a very interesting way. And let me just say this. At the end of the Gilgamesh epic, he's seeking for eternal life. Gilgamesh is. He's one of the first mighty kings after the flood. And he was historical, but there's a lot of myths and legends about him. And but he goes in search of Noah because he thinks Noah has eternal life, right? So there is a connection there, but it goes even deeper. And I thought, you know what? I want to integrate all the ancient, because I do a lot of reading of ancient legends and myths and mythologies, and I think it's fascinating. I wanted to work those all in together with the Bible, much like C.S. Lewis did, with Narnia, in the sense of, how he sort of integrated all these other various pagan notions, and he sort of placed them all under the lordship of Aslan. And so, in other words, I show where these false pagan religions came from, and they're rooted in some kind of reality. And so I tell him that story. Then the fourth book is Abraham Allegiant. And my premise is, what are you going to do, to retell the whole Bible? No. I said, I'm only going to retell the Bible stories that have Nephilim or giants in them. Chronicles of the Nephilim, right?
Right.
And or the Watchers, So then that gives me a basis for which stories to tell. And that's why sometimes I'll jump 400 or 500 years, like from Gilgamesh to Abraham, or from Abraham to David. And so, I'm sorry, from Abraham to Joshua. So Abraham Allegiant tells the story of Abraham, and I draw from other Jewish legends and stuff, which, again, this is speculation. I try to fill in between the lines of the Bible without contradicting it.
Right.
And so, Abraham, there's a legend that Abraham may have met Nimrod and known Nimrod, and I don't know that that's true, but I use that legend and I tell that story. And then I have Sodom and Gomorrah in there. And then I jump ahead in years to the Promised Land, which, again, there's a lot about giants. Joshua slaughtering the giants. In fact, Joshua 11 says that Joshua deliberately sought out the Anakim giants to kill them all. And he said he wiped them all out. And so in the book Joshua Valiant and Caleb Vigilant, that's like a 2-volume sort of story of the conquering of the land of Canaan. I have Moses and Joshua in there, and by the way, my Moses is a flawed character. He's got flaws as well, but he's not barbaric and schizophrenic. I'll tell you that. Yeah, and Joshua has flaws as well. And and there's a lot of sex and violence in there, biblically done, but it's in there, because my view is that the value of your story, the value of the redemption in your story, is only as good as the accuracy with which you depict the depravity from which you're redeemed. So if you don't depict depravity well, what does the redemption mean? Like, I get redeemed from being a nice person? No, people are well, yeah, actually that's kind of true in a way, but the point is that people and society and history is very violent and very wicked, full of a lot of sexual and violent evil and all this, and the Bible refers to that. So I try to deal with it realistically, but not too graphically. But it does push the envelope for some people, and so and then the latest volume then is David, and so now getting up to where David is, I'm like giants, right? So Joshua, it says that Joshua wiped out all the giants in Canaan, except for on the coastline in several cities, such as Gad and Gath and a couple others. And guess what those cities are? They're Philistine cities. Guess who was the major enemy of King David? The Philistines. Guess where Goliath came from? Gath. And so for some reason, and the Bible doesn't say why, but Joshua stopped and he didn't kill them all in Gath. But in the Bible, then David comes along as the Messiah king, because that's what the word anointed means, Messiah. So David, and of course we know that now that David is the archetypal, the typological symbol of Messiah. Messiah would ultimately be a son of David, right? So David was a Messiah of that time, not the final Messiah, but he was the Messiah king. And here's something else. There's some passages in 1 Chronicles and 2 Samuel that, again, these were weird passages talking about the battles of David, and you read these things and you go, oh, interesting, there's a few more giants. They actually name some giants. They have names, and they say, and there's 5 other giants that the book of Samuel and Chronicles talk about that were after King David. For instance, let me read this one. It says, in 1 Chronicles, no, actually, I'm going to jump to, 2 Samuel. It says, 2 Samuel 21, it says, Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze. I think that's like 8 pounds or something. he was armed with a new sword and thought to kill David. And then it lists several other battles in the same paragraph. And then this other giant called, a descendant of the giants called Saph, was killed by another man of King David. And you know, Abishai ends up killing Ishbi-Benob, the giant. Another giant named Saph. Then there's an unnamed giant killed by another guy. And it says this giant had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. And in Chronicles it says that he was an Egyptian who was 5 cubits tall. So that's like 7.5 feet, right? So so these passages are talking about giants who are killing. The context is they're hunting David. And I thought, wow, that's fascinating. And in the past, I would just go, okay, I guess there's still a couple giants in the land, not only Goliath, right? Most Christians probably don't even know about this passage, right? But contextually, they're all after him. Why? It's like the giants are after the seed of Abraham. And the giants in my series are part of the seed of the serpent, which includes Canaanites and people who worship the gods. But I think the Nephilim are also a particular seed of the serpent in the sense that, you know, they are literally the hybrid offspring of fallen watchers and human beings, right? Wild, bizarre stuff, but I believe the Bible's saying that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I you know, so I'm thinking, you know, how am I going to retell the story of David? Because everybody knows it so well, because it's the most, you know, detailed biography in the whole Bible. And, you know, I'm personally, honestly, I'm tired of the story of David and Goliath. I don't want to hear any more. I don't want to retell that story because it's boring to me, right? But then I when I look more and I find these passages and I find out, wait a minute. Then I read this scholar, Conrad LaRue, and he makes this point that, and I have a bunch of free articles on my website, chroniclesofthenephilim.com, where I give a lot of the scholarly basis of some of this stuff. But basically, the scholar points out this phrase that keeps showing up: a descendant of the giants, in these passages. These 4 were descended from the giants. Then there's a 5th one spoken of in another passage. And of course, the Hebrew word for that is not entirely certain. It's Yelid HaRapha. And Rapha is a term that refers to the Rephaim, which were a giant clan. But by the time of David, Rephaim became a term that was generic reference to all giants, so it could be a specific clan or it could just be a reference to giants. Right. Kind of like Kleenex, you know, like Kleenex is a brand that, you know, but it was originally a specific brand. Well, in the Bible, Rephaim were a specific clan of giants, but by the time of David, they're just all called Rephaim. So Goliath is called a Rapha, and so are these other guys. Well, so the scholar makes this point that the word Yelid is actually it's actually possibly carries with it the concept of a military cult dedicated to this Rapha. Maybe that's a god of the giants, or maybe it's just this notion of giants. But he makes a point that it's kind of like a military cult.
Wow.
And a military cult of giants. Interesting. And I thought, well, you know, so I ended up calling, you know, I mean, descendants of the giants is one English phrase, English way to translate it. They're not entirely sure how you can translate it. So I ended up sort of modernizing it and calling them the Sons of Rapha.
That's
and
awesome.
that brings to mind like Sons of Anarchy, you know. The point is they're like a gang. They're like a squad of assassins. And so I decided that's the story I'm going to tell. Is I'm going to go into the world of the Philistines. I'm going to go into the world of these giants, particular giants that are named. And I'm going to tell their story and how it intersects with David. And so I actually start way back where the Philistines first. Goliath is a young 17-year-old, and the Philistines capture the ark, right? And that's in the Bible. And so I start with this notion that maybe it was Goliath. Maybe Goliath was a young man, and maybe he was the guy who captured the ark. And of course, that's speculation again, but it still fits with the biblical story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then when the ark spreads, you know how people will remember that the ark was brought into Gaza and Gath, and it brought plagues with it, little mice and stuff, right? And so they got so fearful they brought it to the next city, and then the plague hit the next city. So God was like, it was like a Trojan horse, right? And God was like striking them dead. So they finally like put it on an ox cart and set it out. We don't want it, And so then if Goliath was the guy who captured it, people are starting to look bad at Goliath, right? But also Goliath then has this vendetta against the Jewish God that makes him seek to become the mightiest champion of Philistia. And so when David finally meets him, he is, but he's also got this team of these other giants with him, and they become the squad dedicated to finding out the Messiah of Israel, because they don't know who he is yet. And of course, when David kills Goliath, he's not a king or anything, and he's just this little kid, so they're like, he can't be that. They don't know who the seed of Abraham, the seed of the woman is, who's fighting the seed of the serpent. They're trying to figure it out, and once they do figure out it's David, then they hunt him specifically, see? And then so I have that storyline, and then I sort of weave it in with David's own story, and I also bring in a good Philistine, Ittai the Gittite, who in the Bible ended up being one of David's most loyal followers, but he was a Gittite,
Right.
which means Philistine from Gath. So we don't know about him in the Bible, just that he was a great warrior for David. So I come up with a really cool romantic story where for himself, and I speculate on him, and then I also try to cover for those women in the audience, but not just women, actually, quite frankly, for me. I have David's relationship with Michal, his first wife, and Abigail, his third wife. And I tell that romantic story, and it's also, there's some problems with it too. But nevertheless, I tell that story of love, first love with Michal, they're young. And so my point is that I don't just reveal all the violence and sexual evils of the time. I also contrast it with what I think is at least a good view of marriage and of love and romance. But it does go bad, right? Because David becomes the first polygamous king in Israel, and that is actually a fault. But nevertheless, it starts out with good intentions and all that. And David, my premise of writing the story is threefold. One, David had a heart for God. We all know that. That's his heroicness, right? But it also shows that David had a weakness for women. And so I try to bring that in as a fault. And then thirdly, that he also had a bent for blood. You know that by the end of his reign, God said, you're a man of too much bloodshed, so David was not able to build the temple that he wanted for God because he was a man of bloodshed. So I bring that reality into it as well. So my David is he's a flawed character, a flawed hero, but he also, was a man of much passion. It's just that when you're passionate, you have great ups and great downs. And so I try to bring that reality into it and show you a David that you may not have ever seen before, because I also bring into the story some of these other side characters that you may not have ever heard, but are very crucial to the story. And lastly, since I'm on a roll here, and feel free to butt in if you ever.
Oh no, I love listening to you. This is fascinating.
All right. So then the last thing I wanted to there's a lot of weird things in the Bible, and this whole Chronicles of Nephilim series, I try to honestly confront weird things in the Bible that I have a hard time even understanding sometimes, let alone believing. I'll admit that some of the things that the Bible says, it's hard to believe. I'm not a perfect believer. I believe, Lord, help me in my unbelief, right?
Yeah.
But I want to remain true to what I see in the Bible, and so I bring this stuff up. One other weird thing that I'll talk about in the David story is connected to the Chronicles of Nephilim is this notion of hybridization, and and I know, Josh, that you've dealt with this a lot as well, and the whole Nephilim nut crowd, as I call us, are really into the whole genetic splicing and all that. Now, I'm not one of those guys who's as much into like the end times and the future stuff as you and several of the other great guys are. I'm more into the ancient world, and I kind of have some different views of what may be happening in the future. But nevertheless, the one thing that we are agreed upon is that there is this strange sort of hybridization going on, right, with the angels and humans.
Oh,
and
yeah, absolutely.
Modern Christians or non-religious people, for that matter, can deny it all they want and say, "Oh, that's silly. That's not possible." But if the Bible's true in what it's saying, I think it is a strong possibility. It's not the only interpretation, I'll admit that, but I think it's probably the best interpretation. And so occasionally some of these hybridization things show up in the Bible that make you wonder. One of which is, as you know, the cherubim.
Yes.
I don't know what your book is about, but the cherubim are basically sphinx-like creatures that have like lion bodies, and so they're all different varieties. But and even the Bible itself, it describes them as having multiple heads and faces and lion bodies with wings and all this kind of weird stuff. And so if it's more than symbolic, which I think it is, but
absolutely.
But nevertheless, one of those weird things that shows up in the David story, I'm thinking, like, as time goes on in the Bible, there's less and less of these wild things that show up. Like in the time of the primeval era, like Noah and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of things that we just don't know, and there's not as much detail, and so there's some weird stuff. And I thought as time goes on and they get more historical, you have a little bit less of that, but still stuff shows up. And so one example is the Lion Men of Moab.
Yes, I was hoping you'd bring that up. That's one of the most interesting, and it's so funny how it's written too, because it's just barely mentioned, but there are connections to other places. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes, there is, and let me read the passage for your listeners. So in 2 Samuel, it talks about Benaiah, who's one of the mighty men of David, and I have Benaiah as one of my main characters. He's the captain of David's bodyguard. And it says he was a valiant man of Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck down 2 Ariels of Moab. He also went and struck down a lion, etc., etc. And this word Ariels is translated in different ways depending on your Bible translation. The reason why this particular one calls it Ariels is it's transliteration, because they don't know what it is for sure.
Right.
The word in Hebrew is Ariel, and but there are plenty of it's really a composite word for lion and God. Like, so some people may think a lion of God, but that's a phrase that is not just, it's more than just some symbolic reference. It's more than likely more than just some phrase of a symbolic reference to lion-like warriors, because they're so good warriors that they're like lions, right?
Seems like you'd see that more in the Bible if it was
exactly.
just that.
Exactly. And now, interestingly, actually, the word that you do see a lot with mighty warrior is Gibborim.
Right.
Which, incidentally, the first time we see Gibborim is in the Nephilim passage in Genesis 6:1, and it says that the Nephilim were Gibborim.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and the word Gibborim means mighty warrior, and that's why David's mighty men, the word for mighty men is Gibborim. Yep. So there is a word for mighty warrior, and that's not the word here in 2 Samuel 23. And so some scholars make some strong arguments that maybe it's this like lion-like hybrid, because the Lion of God thing is this strange connection. They're like supernatural things because they're like lions, but they're warriors, right? And it says Benaiah struck down 2 of them, and again, the context is they're after David. But then in 1 Chronicles 12, it says this: from the Gadites there went over to David at the stronghold in the wilderness, mighty and experienced warriors. There it is, that Gibborim again. Expert with shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and who were as swift as gazelles upon the mountains. Now, obviously, your first implication is, look, it's just symbolic, because swift as gazelles, all right? So obviously, faces like lions could be symbolic. I'll grant that. But knowing a couple things, like faces were like the faces of lions, they could have just said they fought like lions or something, but to say that their faces look like lions, could be a little bit more. Secondly, the Gadites, their tribal allotment was actually over the Jordan, on the other side of the Jordan. And guess what land it was in? Moab. And then it lists, wow. and in 1 Chronicles 12, it lists names of these specific Gadite warriors who had faces like lions. So I actually bring them into my novel, David, and I named them. So what I do is, again, a little bit of speculation, but I think that, well, maybe these were those hybrid warriors, and if they're Gadites, the Jews allowed a lot of in David's band of warriors, there's a lot of people who came from Canaanite and other, non-Israelite tribes, is my point. And there could have been my understanding then was that there could have been a lot of in Moab there could have been some converts basically, and because in Gad, and they became part of the Gadites, and maybe these were these lion men of Moab who joined the Gadites, and it names 11 leaders, you know. So I bring that into my story of David, and I you know, I kind of have the men with actual manes, and they kind of have lion faces, and they're strange, and they don't understand that they're just hybrids to them, and they don't know where it comes from. It's some supernatural thing, and these are mighty warriors. But actually, they joined David and helped him. But then there's a couple of them that are traitors, and they try to kill David, and then, you know, I tell that story as well. So I bring that into the story in a really cool way. People will really find it fascinating. Again, all as consistent as possible with the biblical text of admittedly strange verses that we're not entirely sure of, but I think it's a possible interpretation myself. So I bring that kind of stuff in, and in past novels I brought in satyrs and stuff like that were demonic, and that showed up in the Bible as well. And this was what was part of David's story. So it was a joy for me to be able to bring in that sort of supernatural element as well.
That is so cool, and I'm glad that you did so. And yeah, and you know, it's interesting because when we look into, you know, the cherubim or the angels of God, you know, we get two types of descriptions. When they're, you know, on Earth just in physical form or whatever, they pretty much look human. But when they're seen from their heavenly perspective, or like from Ezekiel's a great example of that. They seem to be like this amalgamation between animal and human. And you know, the interesting thing in research for my new book is a lot of the surrounding cultures had descriptions of the same thing. They didn't call them cherubim. They had like Lamassu and Shadu and stuff like that. But when they actually built statues of these things, and it's the same physical description.
Yeah.
And you know, the fascinating thing too, and this the first chapter of Ezekiel is just fantastic. It's one of those things I must have read 100 times and have had 100 different ways of visualizing it. But one thing that I've glossed over so many times until just recently, it's, you know, it's one of those things where just one day God will open your eyes on things. Where it talks about the faces, it says on I believe on the right side, it says that there was a face of a lion and a man, and on the left there was the ox, and then I believe the eagle was in the middle. And I always kind of looked at that as like, you know, the faces were on four sides, but it actually doesn't say that. It says on the right was the man and the lion. I actually think that's a mix of a lion and a man just on the right side. I don't think it's two separate ones. Yeah, when I really looked into that, and then especially looked into the Hebrew and everything to really try to piece together what was being said, it doesn't talk about, it gives the directions left, right, and front, but it doesn't say back or anything like that. It just talks about those two faces on the right side. And at first I thought the faces were like side by side, but when trying to visualize it and reading it, I think that it was you know, like a lion human mixed face. And then especially later on, I forget the chapter, I think it's 37 or 38, but later on in Ezekiel, when he's talking about the temple, he's talking about these and I think it actually calls them cherubim that are in the temple that have a part human and part lion face. And that was something I wasn't aware of before. But yeah, it's fascinating, all the connections that are made with that one really, you know, really brief and obscure passage about the lion men of Moab.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, the Lamassu that you mentioned, that was the Sumerian word, and those are like the people are familiar with the gates of the Assyrian Nineveh palace, where they had the big bull-like creatures with the king-like head on them. Those are the Lamassu.
Yeah.
Those show up in my Noah Primeval and Enoch Primordial because that took place in Sumer. So I have those creatures in there, and I do have the statues, but I also have the living ones too, because genetic hybridization maybe, so
Absolutely.
yeah, so that's I definitely I pull in from all that stuff and bring it into my storyline. And one of the things that I think one of the things I was kind of worried about was that some people who really have a high view of Scripture, they really believe the Bible, that they might be fearful of some of the fantasy elements that I might use in there. Like for instance, I have a literal Leviathan in there that's a sea dragon of chaos, and it has 7 heads. And I know that some Christians believe that Leviathan is a dinosaur. I don't. When I studied it, I concluded that it's definitely a sea dragon of chaos, because all the ancient nations had a Leviathan that they use as the reference to chaos, and their god pushes back the sea dragon or conquers the sea and kills the sea dragon in order to establish his covenanted order. All the gods kind of did that. It was their way of saying our God is the God that created everything, and our covenant with our God is the master covenant, and the Jews did too. But I went ahead and made a literal sea dragon of chaos, and the Bible even says that there are multiple heads of Leviathan. And Psalm 74, where it's talking about the parting of the Red Sea, and God crushes the heads of Leviathan. That's heads, plural. And the Leviathan of Ugarit, or the Leviathan of Canaan at that time, had 7 heads. So I think that there's definitely a commonality going on there. They're using the same notions and symbols and concepts. But I went ahead and made some of these things come alive to show the supernatural, the spiritual truth. So my novels are theological novels in a way, not historical, because we don't know what really happened beyond what the text we read.
Exactly.
So and I'll be honest, like I don't know, I want to be able to push the envelope and bring some interesting new elements into there, but my premise was I want it to be theological, and I want it to show the spiritual reality. So I have no problem saying my books are theologically true, and whether or not how literally historically they are, I can't say for sure, but I'm trying to be as true as I can to all these ancient texts. But at the end of the day, I recognize that this is probably one of the first times that I think anyone's really done that. I mean, Lewis and Tolkien and plenty of Christian writers after them. There's a lot of Christian popular writers now who write a lot of fantasy novels, but these are taking place in other worlds,
Yeah.
But I'm actually sort of playing in that sandbox with the Bible, and people might be afraid of that. That's dangerous, and I acknowledge that. I recognize that. So one of the things I did was, at the end of each of my novels, I put an appendix where I explain a lot of the historical and biblical research behind my story. And this is very similar to what I was actually inspired by Michael Crichton, because he always used to have an appendix at the end of his novel of all the science, the real science that his fiction was based on. Well, I kind of do the same thing, so that people can see that I'm not just making up this stuff and trying to, mesh fantasy with the Bible. I'm actually doing much of what the Bible does itself, which the Bible uses a lot of symbolism and supernatural meanings, and it creates it with history, and it shows, a lot of times it shows the spiritual reality, which is not the same as physical reality. And so I'm trying to do the same thing, and I admit it's tough, and I want to affirm the Bible because I believe in it, but doing this has actually surprised me that a lot of Christians have really responded positively to it. Very few have really said, oh, you're twisting the Bible or altering the Bible. I mean, almost no one has said that to me yet. Of course, I haven't sold a million copies yet. So if I start selling 1 million, then maybe people will come out of woodwork attacking me more. But so far, I've been doing pretty good on the sales with the whole series at Amazon. Just for your listeners or viewers, they're exclusively at Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and audiobooks. And but I've gotten pretty much all positive responses, with minor differences of opinion, and that's fine. But Christians have actually. So my point here, and this gets way back to even what we talked about in the beginning with the Noah movie and the Exodus movie. I think a lot more Christians these days are not. They're not as bothered by, like, if you push the envelope, change a few details or whatever, because they recognize in order to tell a story, you have to cut things out, you have to telescope time sometimes you have to combine characters because you don't have the page count to be able to tell every story, and you want to focus on the story you're telling. And again, this is what the Bible did, because if you read the book of Chronicles, the book of Chronicles leaves out a lot of details of David's life for a specific political reason. For instance, it leaves out all the real negative stuff of David, like his deeds with Bathsheba, not even in Chronicles. That's only in Samuel, right? And so even the Bible itself tells certain stories and picks and chooses to make its theological point. And that's what I do in the Chronicles of the Nephilim series. And I hope people will love this new one, because in a surprising way, because they already love David, but it really gives a unique new view, fresh view, while still remaining true to the Bible. So it may actually bring some freshness to the original story that makes you go back to the text and reread it again like you haven't seen it before.
That's awesome, and those are my favorite types of things to read that do that to me. And I remember one of the, I grew up real traditional Baptist and everything, so whenever we did get into Old Testament, it was usually just the regular Bible stories, but Genesis was always one of them, and we always kind of glossed over Genesis 6. So I was familiar with the text, like I knew it, and I knew I had read it, but I never really thought about it. And it wasn't until I started finding people like L.A. Marzulli and things that really got me looking at that from a whole new light, and that changed my life. So, I mean, there have been so many times that I have read a Bible passage over and over my whole life, and then have somebody come along and that gives me a fresh perspective on it, and a lot of times a more accurate perspective of it, that reignites the whole thing for me and gets me excited about it all over again. And I believe that's what you've done here with David, and especially bringing in the Philistines and things like that, and kind of telling that side of the story, because that's something that traditionally it's not told like that. So that's really cool, and I'm excited about that.
Well, look, there's a you read things in the Bible, like David has these battles in the Valley of the Rephaim. Yeah. And you're like, oh, that's just the name of a valley. Yeah, but Rephaim are giants, folks. And the notion there is that they called it the Valley of the Rephaim because there's probably giants there that David conquered. You know what I mean? And so I too, like you, I start when you have people, who open your eyes to these things that you hadn't seen before, and you see it in a fresh way, and then you see these connections that you didn't see before, and it just makes it come alive in a new way. And this isn't in contradiction to the Bible, and I'm not even saying that this storyline of the War of the Seed, as I call it, is not some Gnostic secret truth that only the initiated can see. I'm not even talking about that. It's just simply, look, one of the big problems, I think, with our denominations, including my own, I come from a Reformed denomination, and I've been evangelical, I've been Baptist, I've been lots of things.
Yeah, me too.
We all have a tradition, but you've got to be aware of your tradition. There's nothing wrong with that. You can't escape a tradition. You can't say, oh, I'm an independent Bible believer, I just believe what the Bible says. Well, guess what? Lots of people have gone long before you and have figured it out more than you have, and you're usually fall into some kind of tradition, and that's okay. We're creatures of tradition. You just need to be aware of the fault of the weaknesses of your tradition, and be open to learning from others. That's all.
Absolutely.
And so, I think I got off the topic point that I wanted to make, but of just seeing the Bible through fresh eyes. It's not some secret thing, but one thing I have discovered is that modern Christians have a very modernistic sort of bias to their understanding, a very cultural bias to their faith that they don't realize. They think, I just read the Bible plainly. But they don't realize that, no, the Bible is so far from us culturally, 3,000, 2,000 at least years, but as long as 3,000, 4,000 years before us. That culture is so completely different. There's so many things that they did that we don't understand. Yeah. But when you translate it into English, we're interpreting it by our own modern eyes, by reading it plainly, which is actually not biblical. Mm-hmm. So the argument I'm making is, I think there's a new wave, I think, of scholars who are encouraging this, and a lot of us Christians are recognizing. I know you're one of these as well, and that is, the argument is we've got to understand the original context of the Bible, of the
Yes.
text, and what it meant to the original writers and readers in their plain sense, not our plain sense, because you can read things in the plain sense in the biblical text and misinterpret them. There's many cases of this that goes on, and I even mentioned one already before. We read the word slavery up, and what do we think? The Bible condones slavery because it gives all these laws about slavery, and we have no idea of the nature of the way the case laws of Exodus, what the purpose was. It's completely different than what we're thinking. And not only that, but the English word slavery is really not a good translation of the Hebrew word behind it, which is eber. And the fact is we are thinking antebellum South, human chattel slavery, black people. But that's not what slavery was back then. It actually was more like indentured servitude. It was actually more humane than our modern welfare system. So my
no kidding.
So my point is there's lots of stuff like that, and that's why we can misinterpret it if we just read it plainly. So we have to seek to understand that original ancient Near Eastern context as much as we can, and we're never going to be perfect about it. But I think this aids us in understanding that. And one of those elements is this storyline of the seed of the war of the seed, which, when it really comes down to it, I think that there's many storylines going on in the Bible. Obviously, God is a multifaceted author, and there's lots of storylines. But the Messianic seed war ends in the New Testament. That's going to come with my next book, Jesus Triumphant, which I'm going to write that this year. But Jesus as the Messiah, there's all these passages. He casts out. There's all this demonic activity that you don't see in the Old Testament, and Jesus casting out demons. Why? And it also, there's a lot in the New Testament that talks about Christ, the Messiah, in his death and resurrection and ascension. He had victory over the principalities and powers, the spiritual wickedness, right?
Yeah.
And they understood in the ancient world that supernatural powers were over the natural powers, and so what happened on earth happened in heaven, sort of thing. They were connected. And so there's this theological concept of what's called Christus Victor, meaning Christ as the victor over the principalities and powers who are controlling over the earth. Well, where does that come from? Deuteronomy 32:8, where God says, in fact, let me read that passage to you, because I think it's real key to this. Deuteronomy 32:8 through 10. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, He's giving nations an inheritance. When He divided mankind, when did He divide mankind? Tower of Babel, right?
Yep.
He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Well, we're not sure who these sons of God are, but there's certainly those divine beings from God's, right? Are they the fallen ones? That's what I think they are. But the Lord's portion is His people, Jacob, His allotted heritage. He found him in the desert, in the howling waste of the wilderness. And so God's saying, basically, I'm giving all these pagan nations that hate me, I'm going to put them under the authority of these evil, demonic watcher beings, basically. They're territorial spirits, whatever you want to call them. But I'm going to be the territorial spirit of Israel, and I'm going to claim the land of Canaan. And then I'm going to take that nation away. But then ultimately, in the long run, Messiah will bring all nations. He'll conquer all the spiritual powers and take their authority away, and all nations will flow into the kingdom of God, flow into Zion. See the language I'm using is, this is my point, is that this is one of the spiritual theological themes that's going on in the Bible. That's a very powerful Jewish, ancient Near Eastern notion, but we don't pick it up because we don't think in those terms. We think in very modern materialistic terms, and we tend to think that angels and demons, I guess we believe in that, but we really don't want to, because that, doesn't have scientific explanations, right? And even my point is, even Christians are cowing and afraid to sort of support the supernatural viewpoint, supernatural worldview. And so consequently, we get sheepish about these things. But we also miss this beautiful, wonderful storyline of God's messianic victory against the seed of the serpent and with the seed of Eve, which is ultimately the seed of Abraham, as Paul says in Galatians, and that seed is Christ. So that's why it's all connected and all wrapped together in a very beautiful theological story, and that's kind of what I'm telling. And that's what I think I didn't see for many, many years until I really started looking into the Nephilim, the Watchers, and the cosmic war of the seed.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Deuteronomy passage too, because that's something I touch on a little bit in my book just to explain some things further. But I was brought up in, it wasn't King James only, but it was kind of like King James preferred Baptist church.
I like it.
Yeah, they wouldn't really condemn you if you came in with another Bible, but they would buy you a King James Bible if you had like a NIV or something. But so I was always brought up with, well, the King James is the most accurate and of the English translations, and it's divinely translated. You know, there's no reason to look into the original languages because it's a perfect translation, which perfect translation, it doesn't exist. And I used to believe that, but that passage was actually, the Deuteronomy one, was actually the one that kind of got me out of that mind frame, because in the King James it says sons of Israel, which is inaccurate because there was no Israel at the at the Tower of Babel. That didn't come till way after that. But yeah, it said in the King James it says that God divided the nations according to the numbers of the sons of Israel. That's not in the original languages. Like when we the Masoretic text, or when you look at the Septuagint,
it actually is in some, but that's part of the problem, is that some texts have that, but the more ancient texts, like they recently found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most ancient version of that, Deuteronomy 32:8, does say sons of God. But there are some manuscripts that have sons of Israel and some that have sons of God. And that's part of the problem. What you're referencing is that there is not absolute uniformity in the manuscripts. And so translators have to pick and choose which they think are the superior text. And I don't have any problem with that. Yeah. But it may be offensive to Christians who think like, that can't be because everything's got to be perfect, as if God, like, this is another false Christian belief that they think is biblical, but it's not, that they believe like God dictated the Bible or something, you know, and like the Bible doesn't say that at all. I mean, the Bible says that they copied letters and passed on. The Bible says that Moses used sources. There's like 20, 30 references in the Old Testament where it says, well, I got these facts from the book of the Wars of Jehovah, or it lists like 20 different books. The book of the prophets Gad. But where's that? Yeah. That's not in the Bible, but they're telling us they got their facts from other sources. God didn't dictate it from heaven. That's a false Islamic-like notion, actually, and it's going to kill you, because when you look into the biblical texts, the real manuscript thing, there's lots of variations. And I'm not saying that therefore you can't know what the real text is, but all I'm saying is there's lots of little subtle errors and issues that we're not sure about because we have multiple manuscript, you know, and there's a way to discover what's the best or the superior texts, because sometimes you can see which ones are bad translations or not, or sometimes the older manuscript is better, but not always. Because, for example, the Masoretic text is the Hebrew text. Everyone says that, right? But the Masoretic text is actually the latest text. It's in like the 600s, written by Jews who, by the way, this is after Christianity has flourished, and they have specific agenda to avoid and get rid of Bible verses that reinforce Trinitarian type notions. So you'll actually see a plurality of divinity in heaven. They have that agenda. So if you compare Septuagint and some of the Dead Sea Scroll versions with Masoretic text, you'll find that the Masoretes actually had a bias, and they cut out some of the verses they were afraid of, I think. And so the Hebrew text is not the oldest text, actually. We have some of those now with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Masoretic text is not the oldest. And the Septuagint, which was again, it was a Greek translation of the Hebrew, but it was the most ancient that we kind of have, other than some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Jesus and the apostles quoted the Septuagint, and that is not in total accord with the Masoretic text. does this mean that the Bible's not reliable and the Bible's a fraud and you can't trust anything the Bible says? That's the kind of goofy extremism that Christians have built with their ideas of how to understand Scripture. Like, no, of course not. Like the Victrola dog from RCA, that logo where the little dog's listening to the scratchy record. It's like, you can still hear the master's voice through the scratchy record. So what if there's some little issues here and there with the text? That doesn't mean God doesn't get his word through. Of course not.
Exactly.
And so realizing that helps you to free yourself from a lot of these Christian biases that are very modernistic, trying to make the Bible into some kind of some kind of a scientifically, exact text. And it was never written that way, and it wasn't delivered to us that way. But it's okay. It doesn't matter. Still God's word. God's word still gets to us. You know what I mean? So
Yep.
yeah, that's really, I've had some of those same realizations myself. Although I was never in a King James preferred church, but my heart goes out to you for that one.
Yeah, you're lucky. That instilled in me years and years of things that I had to work out later. But God is good, and but yeah, and a lot of those things too. It's just common sense. Like, especially like the Deuteronomy is a good example of that. Well, what makes more sense? Sons of God, which we already know is a thing, that's already talked about in the Bible, or sons of Israel when Israel didn't exist at the time, and there were no sons of Israel. So like what it's just it's common sense. a lot of it turns out, and I've never found anything that's necessarily a salvation issue with things like that. That stuff's real. It's straightforward. It's easy to understand. Usually with this, it's like the little details that I find fascinating. I build my whole ministry on those little details. But and I love searching that stuff out and trying to figure out what's the what it's trying to say, and then it opens up more possibilities that just bring the Bible alive even more. So I kind of like that there's some mystery to it, because it's not anything that threatens our salvation. It's not anything that threatens us being able to witness to others or our apologetics or anything like that. As long as we have the right understanding and can put those things in perspective. And of course, we have to have humility too, and realize that as much as we would like to think so, we don't have all the answers, and there are other interpretations out there. There are other ways of looking at things that don't conflict with the gospel, but they're just different. And we all have those. You're not going to find two Christians that have the exact same view on every aspect of theology imaginable. It's ridiculous. So, but
in fact, you and I are a good example of that. We're friends, and we have this interest in the Nephilim, and yet we have a divergent view when it comes to end times and eschatology. But that doesn't mean we can't support each other and listen to each other, and that's what we do. And
absolutely,
I would hope that more Christians could get like that. And obviously, it's better when we can focus on things we do agree on. And like you, I'm also interested in a lot of the esoteric things in the Bible, or the little details that are fascinating. But and hopefully we both are making sure that even though that's our personal interest, and we bring that to the body of Christ as our gift or whatever, hopefully we are still majoring on the majors, in terms of our heart is still to lift up Christ, and to the gospel is the calling to the world that's going to redeem people, change lives, and change culture, and all that kind of stuff. These extra oddities or interesting anomalies, or whatever you want to call it, artifacts in the Bible, I think they help fill out our understanding of the Bible, make the body more humble by recognizing, there's a lot more that we don't understand. But at the same time, if you don't have that sort of minority viewpoint or whatever, you can also create a bad false picture of Christianity as well, because even if you get this sort of approach to faith that's just, again, ends up being a modern Western understanding of Christianity, because they don't take into account these other things. They're afraid to deal with them, and they create a kind of a false Christianity in a way,
Yeah, yeah,
And I'm not saying
absolutely.
you're not saved. I'm not, don't, you guys out there, if you're watching this or listening to this or whatever, I'm not saying that they're not Christians, and I don't mean that in the extreme sense. I'm just saying, we all have a faulty picture of the truth and of the Bible and of our faith. And and we need to be listening to each other and consider the challenges and listen to them and take them into point, or we will become ourselves little tyrants of dogma. And no matter how
Absolutely.
true you think you are, that's not the spirit of Jesus. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, we all see through a glass darkly.
yeah,
And the those more often than not, when I witness to some, most people have heard of Christianity. More often than not, when I witness to somebody or talk to somebody who has already, decided to not be a Christian, and like, well, okay, well, what led you to that? I'm curious. And more often than not, it's because their view of Christianity is not really an accurate, biblical view of what Christianity is supposed to be. I've led more people to Christ by explaining to them that the modern Americanized church nowadays, by showing them what they portray isn't always biblical. I've
amen.
led yeah, I've been more successful in leading people to Christ than I ever was when
Wow.
I was stuck in that, Baptist traditional mindset and just going out. And and back then, I did like, I handed out tracts, I
Uh,
did street witnessing, I
Me
really went
too.
out there. Yeah, I did all that stuff that I don't really do now, but I'm way more successful in reaching the lost by just being honest
Yeah.
and having, God's given me a blessing of humility, which that was a hard lesson over many years, but it's something that I needed, because through that humility, I can realize that I don't have it all put together. I can lead somebody to Christ and tell them how to get saved, and I can show them some interesting things. But there are so many things outside of that are left open to personal interpretation. And honestly, I think that's one of the more attractive things about Christianity, that shows that it was never meant to be this tyrannical thing that it is nowadays. And
Yeah.
when I'm able to show somebody that, and it more often than not, it takes more than one conversation. There's a commitment there, but it's worth it, because a lot of time, once they start thinking and realizing, like, oh, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense, they start coming around. And I've been way more successful. And I'll also say too, those Christians out there that, when and I used to be like this, embarrassingly enough. I used to be really argumentative about things, non-salvation issues that were different than my own. Like the rapture is a good example of that. I used to be all up in, if somebody wasn't a pre-trib rapture believer, then to me they were just a heretic, and
Yeah.
they may as well not call themselves a Christian. Like, ridiculous, right? And
Yeah.
I used to have that attitude about so many things that weren't salvation issues. And I thank God that I'm not like that. And I'm still a pre-tribulation rapture believer, but I'm not.
I'll pray for you. Just kidding.
I could so easily be wrong on that. It is ridiculous. And actually, the funny thing is, and I'm still trying to work out how this works, but I could probably better defend the post-trib rapture belief than my own rapture belief. But it's because I know more about it, because I talk to people. I have a lot of friends that are mid or post or pre-wrath, all these different things, or millennials, and all these different beliefs about that. And I'm open to it. I like talking about that, because it informs me, and actually it helps shape my beliefs too, because it challenges
Amen.
me to kind of look at myself and think, okay, why do I believe what I believe? And does this person maybe have a better explanation based on scripture? And there have been a lot of times that's been the case.
Same
And
thing
what,
here.
yeah,
If I can add something to that,
absolutely.
basically what happens is, also, yeah, I've pretty much been all the views actually. I've
Me too.
Yeah,
Me
really.
too.
I was a dedicated dispensationalist and premillennialist, and I was an amillennialist, and now I'm a postmillennialist, and I know some people might hate that, but I'm a preterist, and that's sort of a minority viewpoint. But at the end of the day, I acknowledge, I may be wrong, and actually, I can tell you what the holes in my system are, and that's what I think. What happens is the more that you do open yourself up, at least listen to the other viewpoints and listen to the best of their viewpoints, not just listen to someone critiquing them so that you can get the answers against them, but you really read the viewpoint. It humbles you, and you start to realize, okay, these other views do have some good points. I can't deny it, and I see holes in their system, but it makes you start to be a little bit more honest about and recognize that all beliefs have holes in them. And I
Yes.
will tell you that right now, my viewpoint, I know it has holes in it, and that's why I may change someday if I study it further. Who knows? But I think that's what keeps us humble and keeps us open, and hopefully we can all maintain that.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that that you and I agree on that, because I think that's so much more important for people to agree on than like all these little things that are out there. Is if we can agree that we have our own views, but we could be wrong, and our views, because we do see through a glass darkly, our views are going to have holes in it. I mean, the pre-tribulation rapture belief, even though I believe in that, riddled with holes, but so are the others. They all
Yes.
are. They all have. It was funny when I can point back to a time in my life where for a year I believed in post-trib, and for a year I've had all of them at one point
Yeah.
or another in my
Yeah,
life.
me too.
And what I realized, and I'm glad that God brought me through that journey, because what I realized is they all pretty much use the same collection of scripture. It's a personal interpretation, and the Bible doesn't tell us everything, nor
Yeah.
should it.
Surprise.
If it did, it would be a book so long you'd need more than 10 lifetimes to read the whole thing. I mean, even just the things that Jesus did in his short time on earth. John said that if they were to be written down, it would take up all the books in the world or something like that. It can't be done. And that's just the life of Jesus. I mean, imagine the whole Bible over thousands of years. So there are more things that we don't know than what we do. God's given us the most important things, salvation and eternal life, and that kind of stuff. But with the things outside of that, like how to interpret prophecy, or how to whether that stuff has happened already or it's still to come, it's not a salvation issue. And I find with things like that, I find both viewpoints extremely interesting. I'm not a preterist, but I find the viewpoint really interesting, and I like learning about views that are different than my own, because again, like I said, it challenges me to look at things in a way outside of how I am already looking at them, so I can okay.
Each of the viewpoints has its strengths that you can learn from. You know what I mean? Like that
Yes.
the other viewpoints don't spend time on because they're focusing on other verses. You know what I mean? And
Yep.
I appreciate that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because like I can get what I can get from preterists is more, they focus on more some historical stuff related to 70 AD that other guys don't talk about, or premillennialists or dispensationalists can deal with a lot of issues about the differences between the old and new covenant that other guys aren't focusing on, and so you learn some, there's each emphasis has some value to it that it definitely is helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the the Christians that want to get like how I used to be, so I'm not judging, but that want to get all up in arms about they're really missing out, because some of the most edifying and just enlightening and just good conversations that I've had with people are with other colleagues such as yourself, that that we disagree, but we're when we talk about it, we're in it to inform each other and to explain our view, not to argue or fight or show I'm right and you're a preterist so you're going to hell, and just all this ridiculous stuff that that
and of course,
is so prevalent.
and you and I, believing in the Nephilim stuff, and like, we're an additional, group of heretics, right? We're those goofy guys that believe in the Nephilim, right? And
Yeah.
so yeah, we get it from all angles. But even within that camp, there's different interpretations too. And actually, I like reading those who disagree with that interpretation.
Yeah.
Because I learn things from it, and it actually gives me some adjustments to my own interpretations. And yeah, so I find that, and at the end of the day, I could be wrong about that too, and I don't think I am, but hey, I hope I'm humble enough to be willing to listen to others. I hate to do this, but I actually have a meeting to get to.
Oh, okay.
So if you don't mind us wrapping it up.
Yeah,
I think we got a good couple hours, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
An hour and a half or something. I'm sorry. I kind of made it a little close to this other meeting, so I apologize for that.
Oh, no, it's no problem at all. No, you told me noon, and I actually lost track of time in our conversation. But no, that's great.
Next time I'll keep it more open so that we can let it go if we have to.
Sure, not a problem. But yeah, that was an awesome episode. And but okay, so for people that want to get the book, which I highly recommend, or want to find more about you or your blog, where can they go?
Best one is chroniclesofthenephilim.com, which I hope has been on my it's been at the bottom of my image there. Chroniclesofthenephilim.com. If you want to just go right to the Amazon, just go to Amazon and plug in my name, Brian Godawa. I mean, it's the only thing, Chronicles of the Nephilim, or the first one is, or the novel we've been talking about is David Ascendant. But you can buy them Kindle, paperback, and Audible, but it's only on Amazon. But all the information about Chronicles of the Nephilim has like author videos explaining things. It has cool book trailers, really cool artwork. I casted all the characters in there. You see pictures of them. I've got artwork. I've got free scholarly articles related to the material in the novels that you can all get for free there. And you can even sign up and subscribe to get my updates. I have this cool newsletter on Nephilim. I call it the Nephilim newsletter. And like the last one, I just did a little article about a giant that was hidden in the Septuagint. There's a reference to another giant in the Septuagint that doesn't show up in our Bible. And so you can find out really cool information like that.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. Well, yeah, people should be looking forward to that, and should definitely check that out. And well, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show. You're one of my favorite people to talk to. This has just been a blast, and we'll definitely have to have you on again.
Likewise, Josh. Thanks.
Absolutely. All right, so that was Brian Godawa with his new book, David Ascendant. Again, I would highly recommend his work. He's a fantastic author, and you'll definitely learn something new as I have. So, all that being said, you have been listening or watching The Sharpening, depending which format you are currently experiencing this show. And I am your host, Josh Peck. Take care, and God bless.